Just gonna wait a bit for the registrant to come on.
Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us to this webinar. Before we start, I will just like to quickly read out the antitrust policy. You are reminded that there must be no discussion of prices, surcharges, fees, cost, particular customers, revenues, market share, or any other commercially sensitive topics. In particular, you are reminded that no market agreements have been or will be decided at meetings of KBEF, whether they involve prices, amount, or areas. Thank you very much for joining us today for this DTR Sea Freight project update. And Sylvester and the DTR team will take it from here.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you, KBEF, for organizing this webinar. So good afternoon and welcome everyone to this DTR Sea Freight project webinar, a project jointly run by Customs and MPI on this 19th of July, 2023. Right, the purpose of today is basically to give you a quick update on where we're at with DTR and if there are any key messages that have come out from since our mandate, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I don't expect this to be a long session unless you have many questions. So I've got the DTR team on the panel, Danny and Carlos, and we've got our project sponsor, Dunya, as well. Emma, unfortunately, is not here today, so she won't be joining us. But we can go through what we have at the moment. Thanks, Daniel. A quick reminder that DTR has been mandated from 3rd of July. For going forward, a DTR is required to move any uncleared sea freight from one approved facility to another approved facility. We have a transition period for phase 3 type movements, which is port to port via sea. But apart from that, everything else that is uncleared and that needs to move from a facility will need a DTR. And this applies to where we have DTR active ports. I'll hand over to Daniel to give us a quick update on our phases.
Thanks, Sylvester. So for FAK movements from port to CCATF, this is particularly important for the submitters. We require the quarantine declaration document, bill of lading, and the manifest to be submitted alongside each lodgement. In some software systems, if you do a resubmission, the attachments will be gone. So always remember to include in the attachments on every submission. We've recently reached out to a few agents around the documents and the attachments. So yeah, just please continue to submit them through. Point 2 is around the QD. Again, this needs to be entered on the lodgement correctly and match what is on the physical quarantine declaration. We've put in a few examples, YY, NNN, which is yes, yes, no, 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 and just make sure that this QD is entered against each consignment, because we've had a few submissions that have come through and say out of the 10 sequences, 9 out of 10 will be correct, 1 won't have the QD entered, so that will be held on our end. And 3 is a very important one, which is around the location of goods, and this refers to the premises where the consignment will be held awaiting clearance. So therefore the location of goods needs to be the correct port codes. We've put a link in there for the UN low codes, which is on the customs website, and this is essential for the FAK movements. And yeah, just don't put the CCA code in. We've seen a few submissions that have had that. Again, your container will not be moving off the wharf if you put the CCA code in. This is pretty much just a breakdown of the DTRs requested for movement of port with no documents attached. So essentially, I think it was last week when we had the webinar, we're sitting at about 17%. So we've dropped down to 16.24% for July. So yeah, continue to attach your documents, and we're closely monitoring this, so we will continue to reach out and provide examples if you're not attaching documents. This dashboard's just a highlight around total FAK applications and containers by company, application and containers by port of discharge, and number of FAK applications per month. So just a quick breakdown. This was as at 17th. Yeah, 17th of July. So overall, we've got 3,594 DTR submitted and 3,409 containers moved, with majority of the applications and containers going through Port of Auckland, Tauranga and Littleton. So moving into the status of the ports, we currently have Port of Tauranga, Port of Auckland, Littleton Port, Timaru Port, Napier Port, Port Taranaki and Mount Maunganui that are currently DTR active for FAK from Port CCATF. The ones that are currently in testing and development will need to be a DTR active port by Friday 1st September. And as you're well aware, 98% of FAK imports take place through Auckland, Tauranga and Littleton. So moving on to the pilot partner status and status of submissions. So I think it was last week we were at about 93%. We've gone up again by 1% to 94.07%, recorded as of 17th July 2023. And this is the volume of FAKs moving on a DTR. So great job. Keep jumping on board and submitting DTRs. I'll now pass on to Carlos to take us through the DTRs for movement of DVAN LCL consignments between CCATFs.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. So this is, if you recall, will be phase 2 of the DTR project. So this is looking at the LCL consignments, which are DVAN from a container, a FAK container at a facility, and then have to move to a different facility. So it might be another facility of yours around the country, or to a different brokerage's CCATF. So the actual process is very similar to the FAK container movement off the port, with just a couple of differences. So most of the data entry is the same. You'll be creating a new ICR lodgement for this, with a DTR request to move that LCL consignment. There's some of the key differences between the FAK container movement off the port and the LCL movement between facilities is that for when you're doing it for an LCL, you still have to enter the original container number for the FAK container, but it's quite important to not enter the QD. So previously, when we're saying if you're moving a container off a wharf, you have to enter the QD, otherwise it puts holds on things. For the LCL movement, you still have to enter the container number, but you don't have to enter or you shouldn't be entering the quarantine declaration answers, just leave that blank. Another really important point is make sure that the location of goods is reflects where the cargo currently is. So for an LCL movement, it's not going to be the port, it's going to be the facility where the container is devanned and where the LCL cargo is currently sitting. That's going to be your location of goods. And then your transit destination, again, is going to be the facility that it's going to be transferred to. So that's really the key points around the LCL movements. The other thing is for LCL movements, documents aren't required. So you don't need to attach those, but just in terms of good practice, if it's just easier to remember, just for any DTR movement, then attach your documents, then that's the way to go. But you don't necessarily have to attach them like you do with FAK container movement. So there are a handful of CCATFs that are not approved for containers, and although we're talking about LCL movements, it's a way that the kind of system is set up to validate when those goods are moved. So out of all the CCATFs, there's only a couple that are not approved for containers, and you might get this error if you're sending it to them. And that is that the TFCF specified as transit destination must be approved for sea containers. So this is a non-issue, and we're kind of working on a solution around this, and hopefully that will be implemented into production shortly. But until then, if you do come across this error, then that's fine to use your customs collector's permit to move those LCL goods until you're notified that that issue has been resolved. Thanks, Dan. So just a bit of a recap around the FCL process for DTRs. So I won't go through all of these because I think everyone's probably seen them already, but these are on the customs website under the FCL DTR movement guidelines document. So I highly recommend that you would go and see that. But essentially there's four scenarios where that kind of outline when an import declaration is submitted for an FCL container, when you should submit a DTR and when you don't submit a DTR. So in these two scenarios, it's looking at when an import entry has been submitted. There might be customs or MPI holds, so you're not going to be submitting a DTR for that FCL movement. And if it's held for customs, it's going to be held for either a customs exam or might be held for some other reason. There's the process that you follow in those blue boxes there to remove holds off the wharf. If we jump to the next slide, yep. So for scenario 3 and 4, so it's pretty similar. So import entry, this is where import entry has been submitted for an FCL. So the top one, customs hold has been placed. There's also MPI hold. You don't need to submit a DTR, so you're just going to wait for the BACC to be issued on the MPI side. If it's a customs hold, if it's held for exam, for instance, the NZCS planners will authorize the movement off the port. If it's held for any other reason and you move it, then it'll be a NZCS 202 form request to get that customs hold lifted off the port. In scenario 4, again, import entry has been submitted. There's no customs hold, there's MPI hold, so it's gone to the TT team for processing. You don't submit a DTR, you just need to wait for the BACC to be issued. Now, for this scenario 5, this is where import declaration can't be submitted for your FCL container. So the expectation is that for FCL containers, you're not really doing DTRs, you're doing an import declaration to move those goods, but we do obviously know that there's some cases where just an import entry just cannot be submitted and that FCL needs to move off the port. In this case, you would submit a DTR request, customs will approve it, so remove customs hold off the port. MPI will decline it, and then you'd have to submit a MPI, a primary industries import declaration or IPI lodgement through to MPI, which will process that and issue a BACC. They'll remove the MPI hold off the wharf, and then that container is good to move. So MPI does not expect any increases in the usage of IPIs around the whole DTR functionality with FCLs, because it's not really a major change from current state. Brokers should use the same rationale for lodging IPI lodgement pre or post DTR, and we're going to be looking at this and monitoring it to make sure that there's not a huge influx. So just to reiterate again, this process is really in exceptional circumstances when a full import declaration for that FCL container can't be submitted. And here we just have some more information around the links to the customs website. So if you've gone to the customs website, you'll see that under the DTRC information page, there's a whole bunch of different documents outlining the DTR process for FCLs and break bulk and LCL movements and other fact sheets and FAQs. These are constantly being updated as well. So if you have actually already gone there and had a look through them or downloaded them, then please keep on checking back because they are updated quite regularly. And we'll continue to do that, especially around the FAKs when information comes up, which is valuable for all industry parties. Those will be updated as well.
Thanks, Carlos and Daniel. We'll open up for questions if you have any. Feel free to put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand and Karine will unmute you. Yeah, it doesn't look like we have many questions, so I'll leave it to it. If you haven't already done so, please jump on and start submitting DTRs. Otherwise, you know where to reach us. dtr@mpi.govt.nz is our email address. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Karina and Kabef, for organizing this, and have a good afternoon.